Thank you for this nice introduction. Today I want to give a talk about facades and why I think that they really are the best layer of your Angular application, just like Angular is the best thing that happened to me in the recent decade. So I've come up with an agenda. First, I'm gonna talk about some facts. What are facades and what can facades do for you? Then we're gonna go over some advantages and disadvantages when you're using facades. Then afterwards, I want to give you some lessons learned from a real project where we are actually using facades in a productive environment. And then, of course, at the end, if there's still enough time, I'm going to talk about context facades and how they can even further improve your working with facades. So about me, you can find traces of me on Twitter and GitHub. I have linked the accounts behind those links. I come from mostly a Java and C++ background, mostly working on server-side implementation or standalone applications in the fields of audiovisual analysis and logistics. But since about 3 to 4 years now, I've been working at Intershop, working on a new e-commerce storefront with Angular. So what are facades? If you think about it figuratively, facades are just walls. They provide switches, displays, and tabs. You have switches where you can trigger interactions and interface with your wall. You can have displays where you query your data synchronously, and you can have tabs to receive your data as a stream in an asynchronous fashion. Of course, yeah, this is all technical. Let's go for some examples. You have a light switch where you switch it on and you expect your wall to have a light being switched on. Then you have, for example, a tap for water on this wall, where you literally subscribe to a stream of water molecules until you unsubscribe by turning this switch, this tap off. Then you have clocks on your wall, where when every time you look at the clock, you can read the current time. If you're not looking, you don't know the time. So this is obviously a synchronous data retrieval. And then, of course, you can also have an alarm clock where when you set the alarm, you're subscribing to the notification that will given to you whenever the time the alarm goes off is reached. So technically speaking, facades are Angular services that are globally available. We do that by decorating our services with the injectable decorator and also using provided in root. This basically makes them singletons, but not quite, as they are provided by the Angular injector. So normal singletons would have a get instance method. Facades provide an API for the U layer to do all the stuff that I have had on the previous slide. So you can access your data synchronously or asynchronously, and you can interact with your state management. Facades themselves don't store any data, they just delegate everything to the state management. So in a visual sense, this means when you have NGRX as your state management implementation, for example, your interface of NGRX would be the store, the selectors you use for retrieving data in an asynchronous fashion, and of course, your actions where you would trigger certain interactions with your system. So if the facade is an interface to your state management, it's exactly there. The same applies for ngXS, where you have the same concept of actions and selectors. Your facades will abstract all the state management away and keep your components clear of any state management. The same also would be applying to Akita, for example. In this case, you would have queries and store objects, which would also be accumulated by the facade and give a clear and clean interface to your components. So what can facades do for you? They provide, as I've previously said, an agnostic and cleanly decoupled interface to your application logic. I especially want to stress the term agnostic. What I mean by that, you can best observe with an example. So imagine you're running a bookshop. At some point, you will have an Angular component that will display an individual book. So this component will have an input property where you give the ID of the book. And then you have to set up a stream to retrieve the book data associated with this ID from the actual state management. With NGRX, you're doing this by injecting and using all this logic here that is marked. So you have to inject your store object. You have to make sure that the book is loaded behind it. So you have to dispatch load actions. Then you have to set up the stream with the selector. So the stream associated with this book. And then of course, if you want to trigger some interactions, you will also have to dispatch actions directly in your component. Is this good? I don't think so. How about taking all this logic and just put it in a facade? So now the facade does all this for you. You have your stream that is associated with a specific ISBN and also takes care of dispatching appropriate load actions for this associated book. And it also uses the selector to retrieve the book as a stream from the store. And then, of course, you have your convenience methods for add to cart, which in turn triggers the interaction. So if you're using this facade in your component, the component becomes really clean. And you're just using the facade and you're using all the implied logic behind this stream. And you can use convenience methods to trigger interactions. So with this usage, certain advantages come by using facades. As you've seen in the example, all the state management is abstracted behind the facade. So your components purely focus on Angular, RxJS, and the facades themselves. This can help tackle knowledge gaps in your team. Not everybody is really that fond of working with NGRX. So how about just giving them a clean interface and so they can continue with their knowledge and learn about state management if they really have the task to be working on that. Facades also simplify the testing approach you use for your components. You don't have to use mocking methods of the state management itself. You can just mock the facade object and inject it into your component testbed, and then your component reacts to all the use cases you are modeling. Facades also provide you with the opportunity to split development into component and state management development. So, for example, one in the team can work with mock data in the facade and do all the styling necessary for the current task, and another one can set up all the data retrieval in the backend, and they basically merge when you merge both development streams. You then have the complete solution. So you can parallelize tasks for development. You can also go ahead and introduce your state management progressively altogether. Like in this talk by RXState, he introduced intermediate service between ngXS and the components, basically just a facade. So have a look at this talk if you haven't seen it already. Facades also provide you the opportunity that refactoring of state management doesn't impact your components because it is completely abstracted away. So you can work on your store as part of an agile development and restructure your store, relocate certain bits of information in the store wherever you currently need it. You don't have to be that specific about everything in the beginning. Yeah, one of the prime examples is the NGRX action creators refactoring that hit us maybe like half a year ago, where all action creators were redesigned from actual class object to just using convenience methods. If you're using facades, none of your components would have to be adapted. If you were not using facades, then of course all the code you're using has to be adapted. And facades also answer some architectural questions. For example, the whole data loading dilemma. If you don't know what I mean, have a look at this blog article by John. He discusses ways where to load data, because depending on which kind of data you are using in your application, there's different ways of where to actually trigger the data loading. With facades, the answer becomes quite easy. Whenever the stream is accessed, you load the data behind it. You can't really do this with vanilla ngRX, because it would have to be done in selectors, and selectors are pure functions that can't have any side effects. Of course, there's also disadvantages when using facades. For example, with facades, you really can't support strict action hygiene. What does that mean? So action hygiene is a principle introduced by the ngRX core team members. It says that you should have an individual action for every source where you trigger the action. So you wouldn't just have one add to cart action, but you would have add to cart from product detail page, you would have add to cart from product listing page, you would have individual actions for every one of those. This helps in the end when debugging your application and you're seeing all the different actions in your Redux DevTools. With facades, you obviously can't do this quite that easy, because you are reusing the same help method for add to cart all the time. And that way you can't really provide support for strict action hygiene. And of course, there's the other thing. Facades are yet another layer in your application. So all the things we have been doing on the server side for years, we are now also doing on the client side, introducing another layer to tackle complexity. But there is the fundamental theorem of software engineering, which actually states we can solve any problem by introducing an extra level of indirection, except, of course, the problem of having too many levels of indirection. So yeah, now let's go to lessons learned from a project. As previously stated, I'm currently working for Intershop. Intershop is a provider for e-commerce solutions for running web shops. We have a quite customizable and performant server implementation, which also exposes a REST API. And since a couple of years ago, we have been working on the Intershop PWA, which is a blueprint store that uses this REST API to interface with our server implementation. So when you're using the whole Intershop platform, our customers and partners are implementing and customizing B2C, so business to customer and business to business shops in quite a variety. So there is business to customer shops with just a couple of products that basically just promote the brands of this supplier. And then there's wholesalers with literally millions of products. And especially in the range of B2B shops, there's quite a variety, because a product itself can be highly configurable. So there's quite a lot of requirements that we have to tackle with this Intershop PWA. So some of the general requirements would be performance issues. So we always have to look out for bundle sizes and search engine optimization requirements. And then, of course, there is an ever-growing list of opt-in features, especially in the business-to-business market, that we have to provide and that have to be switched on easily if the customer actually requires them. And then, of course, there's multiple channels that the Intershop platform can support. For example, if you're running a shop in Europe, you can provide different shop implementations or shop channels for every country with varying translations and shared content and shared product between all of those states or countries you're running your shop in. And of course, you have different taxation and everything that is coming with this approach. And what's especially interesting for the customization is the store front, so the actual components and UX part of the shop, because this is where Facades really help us implementing or achieving our goals. Because sometimes shops are just done for small projects. They just do some CSS styling and then the shop can go live. But sometimes, especially in the business to customer market, the shops are really heavily customized because all the customers want to distance themselves from the competitors. So they have to basically reinvent the shop themselves. So nonetheless, all the shop logic mostly is being reused. And this is where Facades really can draw a clear line between the actual component layer and the styling layer, and of course, the actual shop logic. And because nothing really gets built from scratch in this industry, all our customers want to merge our new features that we provide or the bug fixes that we are fixing. They just want to hang on to our GitHub stream, so our Git history, and just merge all the fixes that we provide. So Facades to the rescue. So let's go into an example, which I have prepared here. So I've come up with a small example. This is accessible via StackBlitz. So basically just a small bookshop. So you have your books listing page with a number of cards. Each behind them is an individual book. And then there's also a book detail page, just as simple as it can get, where when you go to a specific route, then you can see details of the book associated with that ISBN. And of course, go back to the listing page. So here is the books facade. As you've seen earlier, this is just a service provided in root. So there's one instance over the whole application. And as all our components are basically agnostic about if there is state management or not, I can just use the facade to provide mocked up data. So I can set up streams for all books. So this stream, for example, is used on this listing page. And then whenever I go to a specific detail page, I have streams being set up for individual books. And then, of course, an add to cart action. So whenever I add to cart, I have a cart here at the top that accumulates all the books that I have been adding to it. So let's go to detail page, for example, which would be, sorry, let me just move this here. So detail page, where I'm using the facade to connect with the routing params. So basically, whenever I go to a detail page, my current Angular route is changing with the ISBN in the URL. And I just take this ISBN and set up the stream using the real books facade. And then, of course, display the book that is associated with this. This also works for listing pages. There I'm not doing it via route. There I'm using the books list to just iterate through all the list of the books. And of course, for details, I'm using this material card here. So if I'm going to the list item component, I have my template set up with material, and I'm using the stream of an individual book, which is supplied via input parameter. So this here is exactly the example that I was showcasing before. So no real NGRX logic here, no real state management here. Every component is just using facades. But there is one problem that I have engineered here. Let's go to the detail component. What I have done here is I have put this input into a component. I have this add to cart as a component, and I have this component that is summing up the price also as a component. They're all connected via the quantity that is stored as an attribute on the book detail. So, and here I asked myself the question, why are we doing this? So why do I have to bubble all this data around? Isn't it just, isn't there something that I can use that implies all the context for my components? So for example, I am on this route, so it should be clear that this page is only displaying something related to exactly the book with that ISBN. So why am I bubbling this data around? And why am I doing it so explicitly? And for example, this quantity always will be linked if I am displaying it in this way. This is always implied by context that whenever I press add to cart now, I am adding 8 pieces of this to the cart. So I think I have said context quite enough. So let's actually go into context. What is a context? Context is a frame that surrounds the event and provides resources for its appropriate interpretation. So resources is one of the key words here. So my context implies certain data that is being used over the context itself. So contexts basically are everywhere. Contexts imply specific data or specific rules how something has to be done. And everybody is using contexts, especially our designers. They would never place a button outside of the context, because why would they? So why are we being that explicit when we are composing our components? So one complex example for context can be found in our demo application. So I placed the link to the application that I'm currently working on. The Intershop platform provides the concept of a retail set. This is basically a product that consists of multiple products. But I can either buy the whole product as a whole, so all 3 items that are associated with it, or I can just do it individually. So context dictates me that whenever I press this button here, I'm adding the whole set. And the context, just by the way it is displayed here, implies that if I put this to 6 and now press add to cart, then I'm adding just the camera, 6 items of this to the cart. And then again, if I scroll down and I have this button here again, just the way it is positioned, it just means context dictates me this is not one of the individual add to carts. Now we're talking about the whole product again. So just this design, just context basically everywhere. So how can we actually use contexts in our components or in our applications? Yeah, so it would just mean we have another Angular service that we are decorating with injectable. Of course, we want to use dependency injection, but this time we're not using the provided in root. The context itself stores data that is just relevant to the context. So in case of our bookshop, we would be using ISBN and quantity as data that is specific to this specific context. And then we use element injectors to provide our context. So we can use the component decorator, which has a providers array, or we can use the directive decorator, which also has the providers array. And except for this data that is specific to the context, every other data is being delegated to the global facade. So again, an example where I have been using RXState for the implementation of the context facade. Have a look at the talk Reactive Ephemeral State by Michael. I think the context facade is strongly relying on concepts of this ephemeral state management. So have a look later on. So how does this look? You can see here, same application, but now I'm using RXState for my context facade. This basically gives me a state object with those attributes that you can see here. As you've seen on my previous slide, those are the two properties that I actually have to store in the context facade. And then I have the book and price sum as attributes that are inferred by the context or that are generated by the context. So what I'm doing here is setting up the quantity to 1 if it's not set previously. And I'm also initializing my stream for the book itself, which in turn selects the locally stored ISBN as a observable and sets up the stream so that the actual book related with that ISBN is being fetched from the global facade. And then, of course, I have like this as a derived property where I'm selecting the book price and the quantity, which I have in this context facade, and I just multiply them and have my value for display. And then, of course, I also still need the add to cart property, but this time this add to cart doesn't have any parameters at all, because why would it need parameters? I have everything I need. I have here in my context facade. So yeah, the reason I'm using RXState here is because I also did it in real life. I'm sorry, I think for this talk it might be a bit too much at the first glance, but RXState is capable of both selecting and setting properties in a synchronous and asynchronous fashion. So I can use connect and select for the asynchronous way, and I can use set and get for synchronously retrieving data from the facade. So this is actually quite convenient. So now let's go to the example where I had all the bubbling, which was on the detail page. And now there is no bubbling anymore. I don't even have to store my quantity as a component, as a property here in my book detail component. Everything is just implied by context. So, and this actually works. So if I'm clicking add to cart here, then the quantity is being set in the context by this component. This component just retrieves the book and the price of the book, and of course the quantity associated with it, and just displays the multiplied price. And this add to cart component is one of the prime examples why facades are really good. So context facades are really good, because this button now really doesn't care about ISBNs or quantities anymore. It's really just triggering an action, because that's what a button is supposed to do. So on the detail page, as I've said, we can use element injectors to provide this facade, as we don't provide it from via the global injector. We're using the providers array on the component decorator. And then we can just inject the facade into our component. And then, as we have from the activated route, we can get the parameter of the ISBN as an observable, and we're just connecting this ISBN into the facade. And as I'm using RXState here, whenever this component is being torn down, then also the book context facade gets an ng on destroy, and then also this subscription will be torn down. So everything is taken care of, basically. So another way of providing would be via directive. Sorry, wrong component. So now I also have introduced a directive that also provides a context facade. So this input is no longer associated with this component here as the books list item component. Doesn't have any inputs anymore. So there is no ISBN input. So this ISBN input is actually relating to this context directive that is in turn providing the context facade for this. So yeah, I can encourage you to have a look at this example later on. There's quite some things that you can do with this approach. Let's go further with the talk. Exactly the closing words that I have to give you about being ignorant and using context, because we are in our daily lives all the time. Why are we so explicit when we are doing our component compositions? So, for example, if you switch on the light, are you actually caring about the wiring in your apartment? No, you're not. You actually say, I'm switching on the light. You're not using the words, I'm switching on the light switch, because you're just leaving out all the stuff that is implied by the context. Then there's, again, language. So if you say something like, I like it, this is a sentence that can only be used within context. So you can't really use it without context. You always have to use the context to actually say something about the target of your appreciation. And then, of course, this concept is strongly used in Japanese, for example, where you have the particle wa that is used for indicating the context of the sentence or the conversation. So this is a stronger concept than we have with subjects in our Western languages. For example, you can leave out context. So if your sentence doesn't have this particle, the context is implied by previous sentences. Or if you're leaving it out from the beginning, you are talking about yourself. And then you're being ignorant about the way you interface with your environment. For example, if you go to the bank to get some money, you can use the ATM, or you can go to the bank teller. If the ATM is broken, you go to the bank teller. If the bank teller is not available, you go to the ATM. You just provide your credentials. If you want, you can get feedback about your balance, and then you extract the money. You don't really care about the implementation, because for all you should care, an ATM could just be this. So yeah, that's it. Thank you for your attention. All the slides and examples are available on my GitHub account in the project Meetup Facades. Feel free to ask questions there by opening issues, or you can also comment on the YouTube video that is shared later on. Yeah, thank you.